This video is about policing here on the North Shore and indeed right across Canada. My interest in policing really started 3 years ago. Like most Canadians, I was dismayed, disappointed, and deeply disturbed by the dysfunctional organizational response of the RCMP to the worst mass murder event in Canadian history.
That night was filled with confusion, chaos, and communication breakdowns. One officer described the chain of command as too many cooks in the kitchen, and it was unclear who was in charge.
The final report of the Mass Casualty Commission into the April 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooting is a chronicle of failures by Nova Scotia RCMP leadership and policing systems. In particular, the commissioners chided RCMP leadership for neglecting to review the force's own actions in the aftermath of the tragedy, apparently right up to the March 2023 release of the report. And the response of RCMP leadership was appalling. The acting commissioner conceded that he had not yet even read the report at the time of its release.
I need to know. I will need to take a little bit more of a thorough read into the recommendations.
What is wrong with policing? I went looking for answers, and I found that here on the North Shore, there has been an experimental, innovative approach to policing that holds great promise, not just for the North Shore, but all of Canada. Hi, I'm Jeremy Cato, and this is the North Shore. Thanks for watching, and if you have not already subscribed, please do. It's the story of Bob Heywood, the former chief of police in North Vancouver and later Surrey. Bob Heywood's proven ideas about municipal policing began taking shape from his first day of training at the RCMP depot in Regina. Numerous postings brought on-the-job training and a deep understanding of human behavior. He took those learnings and more to RCMP leadership roles before starting a second career as a management consultant. That is part one of our conversation. In part two, the conversation zeroes in on what needs to be done to fix municipal policing in Canada from the perspective of someone who has actually done the work to change policing from the neighborhood up, not from Ottawa down. Here then is our two-part conversation. Your early years as an RCMP member in rural Saskatchewan, you were an 18-year-old raw recruit who left Mission, BC, and arrived in Regina for 8 months of what I interpret, having read your autobiography, as a boot camp. So tell us a little bit about what it was like to be this raw recruit in 1951, heading off to an adventure that took you really all over the world.
My life in Saskatchewan was really where I grew up. I was 18 and relatively naive and underexposed. And when I arrived in Saskatchewan, I was in these little towns and interfacing with all kinds of people and different roles, and it was quite a learning curve. I think in thinking about policing, though, we need to differentiate a few things. One is policing in rural Saskatchewan is probably not too different today than it was then. I mean, it's small towns, small police units, not operating in any hard, rigid system of control that exists in municipal environments. And so there's quite a difference. The other side, I think, where the police have probably improved considerably is in the investigative areas and the specialized investigative, using modern technology, and have made great changes in that direction. So the focus of my attention, though, has been on policing in municipal situations. And that's where the focus, but I guess the underpinning of that came from my time in the prairies, where you're very interactive with the community. I was stationed in Fort Capel in 1954, and the local characters of the town had been there forever. And this fellow that I knew ran a dairy, and he drove down the main street in his rattly old truck, and he was going to park in front of the cafe. And the parking spots were all full. So he just stopped in the middle of the street, got out of his truck, left the door open, and walked into the cafe. And I came up behind him in my police car. And I called to him. I said, "Hey, Barty, is that parked or abandoned?" And he said, "Kiss my ass," and walked into the cafe. Now, that's the way you treat the local policeman. So I had to go and park and go in and have coffee with him. And that was the only way to solve the situation. So it was those kind of personal interactions and the methods of applying the law in a way that wasn't abrasive or as intrusive as probably situations are today.
There's a quote from your book, and you said the Fort Capel experience, where when you were in Fort Capel, that experience, you developed a strong work ethic and probably the start of a longer-term philosophy about police work that exceeded the popular notions of investigation and law enforcement as the only legitimate cornerstones of police work.
The effectiveness of policing in the little towns depended on your relationship with the people. That was the key. That led to successes in the policing activities that you undertook. It was because of the fact you had a very close and intimate relationship with a broad section of the people in the community and were able to communicate with them in ways that they willingly gave you information that helped you do your job. When you get into the urban environment, that goes away.
Another quote from your time at the RCMP Academy, you said, "The program drilled into us ethical issues, a belief in the rule of law, and the need for complete honesty and fairness in the application of the law. When we left the depot, we were all committed to upholding the traditions of the force. The greatest legacy for you of the depot experience was the sense of duty and commitment that it instilled in all of us."
And I think that laid the foundation. I had a couple of incidents, moments of huge reflection. One night in Carlisle, Saskatchewan, I went down to a cafe to get something, and there was a group of Aboriginal people in a booth, and they were causing a bit of trouble. And the proprietor of the cafe asked me if I would do something about it. And I went over there in my aggressive way, and I grabbed the fellow by the tie and said, "Smarten up." And he grabbed me by the tie and said, "Who are you to tell me to do that?" And at that moment, I had a huge thought. I was wrong. I was in the wrong here. And it almost immobilized me. Like I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of the situation without, and at that moment, another one of my comrades came in and the situation was resolved. But it sort of immobilized me. And from that moment on, I had a different perspective.
You spent time in Carlisle and Fort Capel, and was it Blaine was another?
Blaine Lake.
Blaine Lake. So lots of time there, and many of those were very small, two constable detachments. And then you went to Regina for a couple of stints in the late 1950s. So now you're moving more into urban policing. Then you were working with a lot more officers, and you were dealing with different kinds of crime. So what was that transition like to go from 6 or 7, perhaps 8 years of a lot of community policing, a lot of one-on-one, to bigger city policing?
Yeah. Well, the role I played in Regina, I was on the detachment for a while. Then I was on the detective section. And so we were doing in plain clothes. And so it was developing informants and finding ways to get inside criminal groups to solve crimes. The big crime in those days was break-in entries and safe blowings, because every little town didn't have a bank, and they all had elevators. And the farmers brought their grain in, they wanted cash. So the elevators all carried cash in little safes in the floors in the elevators. And it was a kind of little industry of people that went around and attacked these safes. So we used to spend a lot of time chasing these guys around the province. To do that, you had to develop informants, and policing was investigative field of policing was a different matter than sort of providing the community level of service that I had been used to. So it was quite a bit of a change.
You did some study at the University of Manitoba.
Yes, I spent a year there.
And then you became a sergeant and went to Maple Creek. Now you're in leadership. You're officially head of a detachment, small detachment. What was that change like, and how did that help you learn about policing?
Maple Creek was a very different territory. It was ranch country. It was the dry belt. It was where Alberta blew through during the Depression. Like most of Maple Creek came from Alberta. the soil in the 30s and so on. But so it was ranch country. They didn't break the soil there. They just raised cattle, and they had huge ranches, and they were all cowboys.
And Guy, as a young kid, so you were 5, 6 years old in that area. What was it like living in a home which was also the police station?
Yeah.
We had a door in the living room that opened into the detachment, and we had a jail in the basement with the cold air returns that went to our bedrooms on the second floor. So when there were guests, which there weren't that, just occasionally on Saturday nights, there'd be lots of singing and new words that we could learn by putting our ears close to the cold air return. It was a town that Who Has Seen the Wind was based on. So from that point of view, it was idyllic. And Dad's best story, I think, is the one about finding those 2 kids. That Dad, do you remember how you mobilized the town and to find the 2 boys that got lost?
Well, yeah, it was in the evening, just after supper, I think it was, and people came to the door and said, there's a group out at the creek, which was maybe about 2 miles out of town, not too far out of Maple Creek, and it wasn't a huge wooded area, but there was wooded area, and they'd been searching for these kids and they couldn't find them, and they said, we need help. And so I picked up the phone. In those days, we still had telephone operators. And I called the operator and I said, plug me into all the rural lines. And so everybody's phone in the whole area rang. And I said, this is Sergeant Haywood. I have 2 lost kids at this location. I gave a location, and I need men on horseback. And by the time I could hang up and got in my car and was driving out to the site, I could see the dust coming over the hills. There was probably 30 men on horses there inside of minutes, and they found the kids.
1966, you went to Ottawa. After 16 years on the prairie, you were the NCO in charge of a 2-man research section. And you write in your autobiography, your work there in the financial branch, developing new systems to assist with manpower needs. You wrote, as a result of these situations, you had a wider view of policing.
I think when I got to North Vancouver and I took over the detachment, that's when I was introduced to the watch system.
Just pause for a moment and explain what the watch system is.
Okay. In the delivery of policing, you have the on the street policemen. And so we're talking about the uniform branch, the people in uniform that patrol the streets. And they're organized in platoons, and there's 4 of them. And each one, the whole team stays together at all times through their rotation of shifts. And when the shift comes on, it's the same group. And when they go home, they go away and another shift comes in and takes over. And there's 4, and they rotate it. And they used to be on 8-hour rotations. So they worked for 6 and 7 days on a particular shift, day shift, afternoon shift, graveyard shift. And in about the 1977 or 8 or so, the 12-hour shift came into play. And so they worked 12 hours, 2 days, 2 nights, and then off 4. So that significantly changed the role of the policeman on the street. He no longer could follow up on anything. He was on 2 days. So on his 2 days, he had to respond to calls. The 12-hour system led to less follow-up on the majority of stuff. So the role of the policeman on the street got narrower and narrower. It became a response organization. And its focus was on responding to calls and doing it as promptly as possible. So I thought, well, we've got to find a way. And after having done all this sort of thinking about, why don't I create a little team? And I canvassed it for volunteers. I had a young corporal. He had a terrific gift of the gab and was really, really an outgoing guy. And I put him in charge of it. And we selected about 8 or 9 policemen to accompany him. I said, okay, the watch us back out of this area. And you guys go in there and you analyze the situation. Try and find out how you can get next to these people, how you can change some behaviors here. So these young guys, the young policemen went into the community and they would go and meet with all the young guys, and they would go to the places down in the park and on the creeks, wherever they were meeting. The problems in the area started to diminish. And I thought, they were finding ways to, the windows are not getting broken anymore, and they were just interacting with these guys in a different way. And it was very elementary at that stage, and very, I didn't have a full handle on why this was working, but I thought I got to do it in another area. So I set up a second one. When we set up the zone system, the NCO in charge of the zone was responsible for the long-term order in that community. He had to find ways to reduce the problems. He had a different role to play than the NCO in the watch system, which is to see that calls are attended to, things are done ethically, legally, and so on, and the follow-up was handed off to whoever could do it. And so I converted the whole detachment to zones, and we set up the whole zone system in North Vancouver. I don't think I handled it entirely well. I didn't know what I was doing in a way. I mean, I was groping to find ways to do this, and we had all kinds of resistance and things. I knew I was making career-threatening decisions. I knew that. I understood that this may affect my future, but I thought it was worth doing. And it came to the attention of a guy by the name of John Hogarth, who was a new head of the BC Police Commission. He asked me to come on as director of planning on the police commission, and that was in 1974. And the opportunity to go to the police commission gave me a chance to look at all the municipal departments and so on in the province and elsewhere.
You wrote, by the time I left North Vancouver in 1974, I had made significant changes to the way police work was being done in the community. As time went by, I became more and more convinced that meaningful changes could be made in the manner of delivering policing services, and the results would be a community that experienced less crime than they would have under the old system, and there would be a higher level of public confidence in the policing service. So you're director of planning, and you've had this experience. You recognize, as you said, that there might have been some mistakes that you made, that you were making career-threatening decisions, not just for yourself, but for other people reporting to you.
Exactly.
So now what happens?
So then I had the chance to go to Surrey, and I went at it a little more methodically. When they heard that I was coming, they knew they were going to go to the zone system. They knew that was going to happen. They sort of assumed that was going to happen, and I wasn't going to disappoint them. So
change is coming.
Yeah, I know. So I set up a task force of about 10 people, and it involved all ranks. I had staff sergeants, corporals, and young constables on it. And these were people that had a lot of influence. And I said, all right, I sat them down and said, here's where I want to go. And I said, now, what I want you to do is to go out and look at some other police departments around the country. And I sent them to Calgary. I sent them to Palo Alto in California and a couple of other places where I knew that some things were going on. And I want you to come back and I want you to tell me whether we can do what I want to do. And they went away and they did their study and they came back and said, yes, we can do that. And so I had their commitment on board. And then we went about the process and we set up the whole detachment. We took the watch system out. Watch system has the same number of men on every hour of the day, 7 days a week. Under the zone system, the zone commander was tasked to structure his shifts, and they were 8-hour shifts, 8 or 9, something, whatever, to meet the demands of the workload. So plot out your workload for your zone. We started collecting data by the zone and looked at the volumes, and so we had to have a lot more men on Friday nights and Saturday nights than we did on Monday nights. So they had to structure their shifts accordingly, and that was something new. That hadn't happened before. They started now to set up their shifts, and the other thing about it was we had a detective section of about 35 or 40 people, and they had been under the watch system. They would get all the complaints coming from the watch system, and they would analyze them, stack them up in, consistent, look for trends, And then they set up a little group and they go work on a targeted group of individuals that were causing trouble, and they would hopefully get some cases. And they did. They had good investigative skills. So I said, okay, all the investigative work for the most routine crime is going to stay in the zone. So I went to the detective group and got them all in the room one day. I said, I want you to, we sat down and figured out give me the list of the 20 worst criminals we have in this, who are causing us the most harm. So I said, all right, now your task is to get those guys, put them in jail. Do you focus on them, not this riffraff and all the stuff that's coming up from general duty. That's drawing you off into the lower end of the spectrum of the crime activity. I want you on the major stuff, the big stuff, on the higher end of the curve. And then in the zones, what was different now, we had 7 zones in Surrey. Every 7 weeks, a zone would take a day off. And they'd come in and we had identified areas where they need some training. Maybe it was investigative techniques, informant development, or whatever. And we'd have half a day of training. The other half of the day was committed to the zone. So what is it that you need to do differently in this zone? And what we tasked was every individual in that zone, there'd probably be 25 or 30 members, had to set a goal of something they were going to achieve in that community. And then 7 weeks later, we would review that goal and see how they're making out, whether they want to adjust it, want to change it, however they're going to do it. But their goal was to how they were going to affect the problems in their zone. Now, the other part of it was in Surrey, we had 80 schools. So we had formed the zone system around the school system so that the feeder schools led to the high school, and that was all in one zone. So that
family schools.
So the policemen were dealing with the same group all through their evolution there. And we assigned a policeman to every school. And their role was not just to go and talk to kids. It was to meet with the principal, to meet with the school counselors, set up ways that we can find early detection of gangs, where we can find early signs of deviant behavior. And we could get the school counselors and the policemen involved looking at these things. And gradually, over time, as the zone met this every 7 weeks, pretty soon the probation officers were attending zone meetings that served that area. Then the social workers, and then the school counselors. So the zone meeting now got to be a broader event, and it involved the community. So that these people were now starting to work with these people in the community, finding ways to reduce the problem of this high volume stuff that was going on. So it's really shifting the responsibility for the lower end of the policing stuff, which is the problem stuff, back to the community.
You spent about 3 years in Surrey, setting this up. I guess the quick question that many people would be thinking is, what happened to the zone system after you left North Vancouver and Surrey?
Well, the day I left Surrey, a new guy came in there, and he was a clearly old school guy. And he said, we're going to go back to the watch system. And he changed it back.
Dad, how could there was value in what you did, and the next CO was able to just unwind it without any input from council?
I think most municipal governments like to delegate as much of their policing responsibility to the chief of police as possible. They want to get on with the issues of local politics, zoning, building, and social infrastructure, and so on. They like to be able to have the police at arm's length. I think if one of the police departments wanted to change their strategies to a zone system, I don't think the mayor and council would get in the way.
The zone system was the most effective type of system to bring changes to the policing practices in a community. By creating a group of policemen and giving them a specific area to police, it was possible to hold them accountable for the type of service they were providing to that specific community. Superintendent Bob Heywood, retired.